In the 21st century, those who change the world are those who change the culture. They get people in sync, lead tribes, create movements, and generate an energy field where ordinary people achieve extraordinary results.
I think one of the fundamental issues that organisations have to tackle is this question of flexibility and agility, and not just around the when and the where work gets done, but also how much people need to work and how efficient they are. Because one of the things I notice is that although we've got all this technology around us that is supposed to make life easier, in actual fact, it seems to mean that people are working 100% of the time. People are checking emails in the evening. It's dominating and infringing on all of our personal lives.
I'm Aga Bayer, and this is the Culture Lab podcast, where you will find ideas and inspiration on how to harness the power of team and organizational culture. I talk to leadership thinkers, culture experts, entrepreneurs, and all sorts of movers and shakers, and together we explore the fascinating topic of culture, leadership, and personal growth. If you like what you hear, subscribe to the podcast on iTunes. Or better yet, write a review on iTunes and share the podcast with your followers and friends on social media. For more, check out our archive at www.agabayer.com/podcast. Hello and welcome to episode 31. This episode is coming out on the 1st of January 2019, so we have a brand new year in front of us, and I just want to wish everyone who's listening an amazing, exhilarating and fulfilling 2019. I have to say that for me, this time of the year has always been a period when I feel like I need to make some changes or take on new challenges or just shake things up. And looking back, I think one of the most dramatic changes in the past couple of years has been leaving my career with big consultancies like Hay Group, Conferry, and PwC. I decided to strike out on my own and set up a culture consultancy. And because I'm almost 50 years old, when I submitted my resignation, almost everyone I knew said something like, "Wow, you're so brave." And I think that what they probably meant was that I was completely mad to throw away everything that I'd been working for the past 25 years. But here's the funny thing. I honestly believe that nowadays more and more people will experience many more stages in life than just education, work, and retirement. And I just felt like I need to move on to the next stage of my life and of my career. And honestly, I feel that probably I still have good 30 years in front of me in terms of contributing and adding value. So, as I said, I know that I'm not alone in this. According to Linda Grattan, the professor at the London Business School and the author of a remarkable book, The 100-Year Life, the model of a 3-stage life is gradually morphing into multiple stages. And each of these stages could potentially be completely different. So in one, the focus could be on building financial success and personal achievement. In another, on creating a better work-life balance. Another still on contributing to a better society or exploring and understanding our options. And there will be transitions between these stages. They might be marked with sabbaticals, where people will find time to rest, to recharge, to reinvest in their relationships, and definitely to acquire new skills. And in this context, I thought that I would introduce you to someone who talks about effective strategies to manage those longer and more complex careers, and who talks about how to come back from one of those sabbaticals. So Lisa Unwin is the founder of a company called She's Back. And she founded it in 2014 in response to the lack of clear opportunities for women to return to professional life after taking a career break. She'd undertaken research in collaboration with the University of Edinburgh Business School and sponsors from 5 different sectors. And she discovered in that research that there is huge untapped potential in this particular talent pool. Lisa is the author of She's Back, Your Guide to Returning to Work, which is a really practical handbook to help women, but not only women, to reignite their careers. Here we go. Here is Lisa Unwin. Welcome to Culture Lab, Lisa.
Thank you.
So, Lisa, a phrase that I use in the intro to Culture Lab is, in the 21st century, those who change the world are those who change the culture. And the funny thing is that while the world around us is changing so rapidly, our work culture is definitely not keeping up with it. And so we definitely need more people like you who highlight the challenges that we face today and make a little bit of a ruckus to rally people around those issues. Because I really believe that together we can create change. But before we dive into the details of what cultural change you believe needs to take place, can you give our listeners just a very short introduction to who you are and what you do?
Yeah, sure. So my name obviously is Lisa Unwin, and I'm the founder of an organisation called She's Back. And we are there to highlight the potential in women who have maybe stepped back from their careers, maybe in their late 30s, who have got 20, 30 years ahead and really want to make a difference and are currently not able to fulfill their potential.
That's such an important issue, and I'm really eager to dive into it. But before we go there, we always ask the podcasts with the same question. And this question is about the early cultural influences that shaped you as a person. In other words, what made Lisa, Lisa?
I think one of the cultural influences that springs to my mind is that, so I grew up in the 70s. I was born in 1966. So I was a young girl in the 70s. And at that time, when I think about culture, I think about television because that was the primary cultural influence on most of our lives. We all watched the same television programs. We just had 3 channels. And at that time in the UK, the television was full of men. You didn't see women on the television. And if you did, they were just decorative accompaniments to the male presenter. Until along came a woman called Victoria Wood, who was a comedian. She went on stage. She didn't wear a bikini. She was funny. She was smart. And that it was just wonderful as a 9-10-year-old girl seeing this woman who was funny and clever appearing and dominating the airwaves for a while. And after her came French and Saunders and other people. And it was just fabulous seeing that there was an alternative to just having men dominate our culture.
Yes, it's so true. And, sometimes I think we underestimate the importance of having these role models, especially for little girls. Mm-hmm. I grew up in approximately the same time, and it was hard to find women that I could look up to. So I can completely identify with that. And then when you found someone, it was so empowering, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Even female newsreaders, people on the radio. It was really empowering. You're right.
Yeah. So you have this company called She's Back. You also wrote a book under the same title. So what is the origin story of your consultancy and of the book?
Well, the origin story of the consultancy is my story, really. I joined Arthur Andersen straight from university. I was determined not to have what I perceived to be a female career. So I did banking and finance. I did nice hard subjects. I trained as an accountant, and I became partner in Arthur Andersen in 2001. Wow. And I thought that was my career ambition fulfilled. But a year later, the firm collapsed under the weight of the Enron scandal, and I was on maternity leave at the time, and so I had no fees against my name. And when the firm in the UK was bought by Deloitte, I went across to Deloitte, but not as a partner, as a director. And I stayed there. I was quite happy until about, I think it was 2008. My children were 4 and 6. I didn't get a promotion I was expecting. My nanny resigned because she was moving out of London, and I just couldn't figure out how to hold down a job that was very long hours, 48 weeks a year, and combine that with looking after 2 children who were at school 36 weeks a year, and school days were 9 till 3. And so I took a break, and I didn't really think about what I was going to do next. And before I knew it, 5 years had passed, and I suddenly found myself with no idea as to how I was going to reclaim my career. And I looked around and saw so many women in a similar situation at the school gates, and they might have been advertising executives, bankers, lawyers, accountants, all of us with lots of potential ahead. I think I was, 47? I thought, I've got 20 years ahead of me and I've no idea how to get back. So I set up She's Back to try and help others in that situation.
Yeah, and I think that so many people who listen to your story can completely identify with it. And as you say in the book as well, they're probably thinking, this is me, or this is my wife, my sister, my brother. Yes. And this is wrong, right? Yeah. And I also learned from your book that 85% of women on a career break want to return to work, but can't.
Yeah. And
so what are the key obstacles, Lisa?
One of the biggest obstacles is the way the recruitment market works, because it's set up to put people in jobs they're currently doing but with a new employer into full-time positions. And if you are not in that situation, the system really doesn't work. Recruiters don't like to deal with people with breaks on their CV. They're not keen on placing people who want some flexibility. The whole system mitigates against you. So that's one thing that doesn't work. But the other thing that doesn't work, and one of the reasons we wrote the book, is that people approach it in the wrong way. I have many women come to me, and the first thing they will say is, I'm a mother. I've got 2 or 3 children. I'm looking for part-time work. Now, being a mother does not differentiate you, and it doesn't tell me anything about your skill set. And people begin with their limitations rather than thinking about the value they can add. So whilst we need to fix the system, we also need to tell women how to approach the challenge differently so that they can be successful.
I love that because I really do think that as women and some other minorities as well, we do tend to shoot ourselves in the foot as well. So definitely the system is broken, but I think we grew up in that system and therefore we don't have the right tools to promote ourselves and help ourselves in situations like that. So I'm also curious because you've done this research around women who are on a career break. And I think through your research, you also came across not just women, but men as well who went on a career break. So what were the key drivers that people want to come back to work? Because I don't want our listeners to think, women just want that second income. I suppose that there are other reasons that people want to come back to work as well.
Well, interestingly, you quote that I think it was 84% of people we spoke to said they did want to return. But then we asked about the nature of that return. Did they want to be relatively detached from the organisation and just almost earning a second income, if you like, or did they want to come back and be fully engaged and get back on a career path again? And most of them told us they wanted to come back and be fully engaged and back on a career track. These are people who maybe, like I myself, when my kids were 4 and 6, I was shattered. I couldn't hold down that very demanding job and cope with everything at home. My husband was, he happened to be working in New York when we were in London. So he was in New York every week. So, it was a bit of a, I was almost like a single parent during the week. Yeah. It was hard. But when they were 10 and 12 and I had more time on my hands, I've got just as much energy as I had before, if not more. And I'm still ambitious.
Yeah.
And many people are in that situation. They don't want to be written off just because they had to step back for a while.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this assumption is very common that organizations, employers believe that, this person wants to come back because they need an extra income and actually underestimate the driving force behind that need to go back into the workplace. So in your book, you advise people, particularly women, to play a long game. So can you tell us a little bit more about this? What does it look like and how does it differ from playing a short game?
Well, I mean, if you take my example, I played a short game. I looked at the circumstances around me when my kids were small and I didn't get that promotion. And I almost flounced out of a very good job with no plan whatsoever as to how I was going to get back when the need arose 5 or 6 years later. So that's a short game. That's not how not to do it. We use the analogy of a game of chess because if you think about the middle of a game of chess, you might have to make some sacrifices. You give up pieces. And giving up a piece in a work-life context might be passing up a promotion because you can't take on the extra workload, or going part-time because you need to balance other commitments. And what we would advise is if you find yourself having to make sacrifices like that, think about what tactics you can put in place so that in the longer term, you are in a position to win. So, for example, a tactic that I could have done was to perhaps become a consultant to the firm I worked with so that I was still maintaining my client relationships and still keeping my hand in at work. And so I wouldn't 5 or 6 years down the line be floored by the changes in technology that had taken place. The other thing that you can do is make sure you keep your skills up to speed, build your networks. There's all sorts of things you can do if you find yourself having to make sacrifices to position yourself to win in the long term.
Yeah, I love that. And those are simple, relatively simple tactics, but I think that a lot of people who took a career break played that short game as well, because you are almost in a sort of crisis situation. Usually women don't plan to take a break. No. That's why I think so many people resonate with your story, because basically something happened.
Yes.
Your nanny decided to move out and then you were faced with this decision. So you didn't even have time to plan for it.
Yeah, you don't, and often that, you're quite emotional and fairly vulnerable in those situations. And it's not easy to think long term. And other people have vested interests in your decision. So I know, for example, I was speaking to a woman the other day who she's got two 1-year-old twins and a 4-year-old boy. And she really wants to go back to work. And a few people around her are telling her she's mad and she should just enjoy the time with her young children. And they are heavily influencing her because that's the decision they chose. Now, I spoke to her, she really does want to go back to work now. And that's her choice. And she should not be unduly influenced by those people. But of course, she's feeling guilty and is very easily swayed at the moment.
It's true. And I think that's why that conversation about shaping culture around us is so relevant today, because there are so many cultural influences on all the sides. So it's our family and friends, and it's the employment market and recruitment and so many other things around us that will have an influence on us. And so
I think one of the cultural things around us that I do see changing in a way that I think will help is that we're seeing more older women around on the television, in theatre, in films, and it can't change fast enough. But I think that it does help, because one of the things that the women I speak to and are trying to help is one of the things we face is ageism. And that is very difficult. If you're returning, for example, and you're 43, 44, and the organisation you're going back to is used to people getting to a very senior level by 38, 39, it's quite easy to write somebody off because they don't quite look right.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you mentioned this book in your book, which is called 100-Year Life, mm-hmm. right? And I think this is a new reality that is awaiting all of us, that actually our lives are becoming longer and longer. Yeah. And what midlife used to mean in the past for our parents is definitely not what it's going to mean for us. Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also there's a chapter in our book specifically that talks about finance, because whilst, the idea of having longer lives is on the one hand very nice, the challenge of that is that none of us have saved enough for our pensions. None of us really know how much we're going to need to fund our lives beyond 50 or 60. And so we can't afford to sit around and not be working and not fulfilling our economic potential.
Yeah, absolutely. So this, I think, brings us in nicely to a conversation about what needs to change in the wider system. And let's start with organizations. So what would you say should be the key reasons that companies should start valuing people returning from a career break more than they do today?
I think because the people that are coming back from a career break or from having had a period of time doing something different, they're actually bringing a broader experience back to the workforce. And if they haven't been, I'm working with some law firms at the moment, for example, and typically women drop out of law at about 8 or 9 years in. So you have 50-50 at graduate level, but by the time you get to partner, it's 84% male. So they lose lots of women. I've been speaking to a few women who've come back to the legal profession after a couple of breaks, and they weren't sitting at home doing nothing. One of them was building her own business. Another one was doing some property development. And they were bringing up children. But they're coming back with a wider experience than they would have had they simply stayed at the law firm and carried on the same career trajectory as everyone else. So if companies truly value diversity, they need a diverse workforce. They need people with different skills who think in different ways, and that comes from having a different life experience. So for me, that's one of the fundamental reasons that organizations need to think differently.
Yeah, absolutely. So these people bring real diversity into the workplace, diversity of experiences, cognitive diversity, diversity of thinking.
I think they also represent your customer base. So I was talking to someone the other day who works for Jaguar Land Rover, the car manufacturer. And increasingly, the people that are making buying decisions about cars are women.
Yes.
And so if you have product designers a product design team, for example, who doesn't have any women in it, you're not going to be reflecting the needs of your customer base as well as you might. And the same is true of houses. Apparently, again, I was speaking to some people working in the building and architecture industry, and women are very, very influential in decisions that are being made about what house to buy and what features they need in new houses. And again, it's an industry that's dominated by men.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, I think that a 25-year-old probably will not be buying a Jaguar. So
probably not.
Yeah, you would imagine. So I think that age diversity is important as well. So, if you were an organization, what would be the first steps to take to create an environment where people can come back and have the flexibility they need and the support and equal opportunities, and also so that they can create careers that fit their lives, not the other way around?
Well, I think the first thing is to make sure that whatever you do, you're doing it for men and women. It's not. It can't be a gender specific thing, and depending on the organization, I think one of the fundamental issues that organizations have to tackle is this question of flexibility and agility, and not just around the when and the where work gets done, but also how much people need to work and how efficient they are. Because one of the things I notice is that although we've got all this technology around us that is supposed to make life easier, in actual fact, it seems to mean that people are working 100% of the time. People are checking emails in the evening. It's dominating and infringing on all of our personal lives. And if we could just change that so that people have more flexibility at work and get more done in the time they have available, and less of the admin and nonsense that goes along with work, I think everybody would benefit, men and women. And I think that going alongside that, you have to look at what we do around paternity and maternity leave, because the more you start to share work and parenting at a very early age, the easier it is to find yourself in a situation where both parents work and both parents do their fair share of caring. It's very difficult if you've done what I did, which is go the other way, where my husband was the only one working and earning money, and I was the only one doing any caring at home. Well, I mean, not that he doesn't care, but you need
Yeah, that's clear. Yeah, absolutely. So there are very practical things, I suppose, that organizations can do. And again, for me, it calls for a major culture shift, because what we see in organizations still is this culture of presenteeism. So people look around and see who's in the office. And the assumption is the people who are in the office are the hard workers, and they are the ones who generate results. But of course, we both know that is not true.
No. I mean, just because you've got somebody in an office doesn't mean they're working. They could be surfing the internet.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you were advising an organization on perhaps, 3 very specific practical things that they can do going forward to create that environment, what would they be?
I think I would have a look at and overhaul the way you recruit people, because I don't think a lot of organizations realize that the way they recruit means that they get the same people the whole time, because they often large organizations outsource their recruitment to a specialist organization, although it might look like they're in-house. And the way those recruiters work, they're just looking for round pegs to put in round holes. So unless you change that, you're going to, anything else you do is going to be peripheral. If you're recruiting the same people using the same process.
And it's interesting because really innovative organizations like Netflix, we all admire Netflix. And I recently interviewed Patty McCord, and she said one of the first things that she did, and everyone was telling her, this is crazy, is she brought recruitment in-house. And as you say, most of the companies use external recruiters who operate, as you say, on that assumption that I need to find a round peg for the round hole. And she didn't want that. So she said, okay, let's do it in-house because we will do it much better. And recruitment was a huge bet for her. She needed to find the right talent for the organization. So perhaps that would be an idea for other organizations as well.
I think I don't think they realize how exactly what's going on, and how it just it's not producing the results that they want. I think that's one thing. The second thing is I would look at your flexible working policies. But not just your policies, the behaviours, because most organisations have a policy, but you probably find that the only people working flexibly are mothers with young children. And if you look at what happens to their career trajectory, they flatline. They don't get promoted. They don't get good bonuses. They don't get the plum assignments. So I'd have a look at overhaul that completely and look at, and maybe you need to reframe it. Instead of calling it flexibility, call it agility or agile. Sometimes flexible has got such a bad rap that you have to change the wording. And that's certainly what Deloitte did. We mentioned them in the book, actually. Their flexibility policy wasn't working at all. And so they had a complete overhaul. They called it agile. They made it very clear from the top down that it was something they wanted everybody to see and to use. And they role modeled it and made sure it was adapted by men and women. And they've had a transformation in the levels and numbers of people and profile of people who take up the options that they offer around agile working.
Yeah. And again, an extremely important thing to do and extremely hard to do, because I think it's cultural as well. Actually, again, going back to Netflix and our conversation with Patty McCord, one of the policies that was very, very well known was that there was no vacation policy. So basically, you could take as much paid leave as you wanted to. But the interesting thing was that actually people were not taking the vacation days in fall anyway. And the reason for that was peer pressure. And so I think policies are one thing, but then there is the cultural bit. And if you see, people around you and who gets promoted and who gets fired, you very quickly figure out that it's not the ones who do the flexible or agile working, but the ones who are there and the ones who spend endless hours in the office and so on. And so
Deloitte had to, when they introduced their agile working policies and options. So one of the things you can do there is you can take an extra 4 weeks leave unpaid in a year. I think provided you've been there 3 years, and you can tag it onto holidays. So effectively you can have the whole of the school summer holidays off. And they role model that from the top. So they have the very senior partners taking that option so that it's very clear that this is possible and it's something for everybody. And it's something that won't be frowned on. In fact, quite the opposite.
And, it's not surprising, because I think that if you want to create a change like that, your top leadership really needs to walk the talk.
Absolutely.
it will never happen if all the senior partners are working round the clock and are almost sleeping in the office.
Yeah.
And then you just say to your people, yeah, of course, you can, take those flexible hours or whatever. It won't really work. Okay, so creating, reviewing, rethinking your flexibility policy is a second thing. Is there anything else?
I think the third thing I would do is just have a real, and this is about women, it's have a look at where and when all the women leave. And as I say, for a law firm, for example, they leave at senior associate level. Now, if you're not happy with that, if that's okay and you don't mind, then fine, continue, plod on. If you're not happy with that, then really seriously look at how you can introduce flexible career paths so that there is a possibility, for example, of maybe going part-time or taking a less demanding role when people have got, and it's not just when people have got young children, it might be when they've got other caring responsibilities or other things going on in their lives, but make sure that doesn't necessarily then write them off for the future, which is what happens now. Yeah. So really look at what interventions you can make and actually train both line managers and the women themselves about how to play the long game.
Exactly. Yeah, totally. I was going to say that it goes back to that point about the long game, because I think if you play the short game, this decision to take an alternative career path while you see your colleagues progressing and becoming partners, it can be a very, very hard decision.
And it's really annoying. These are ambitious young women who are used to getting promoted just as fast as their peers, and it's not very nice. I've been there.
What would you advise young women at that point in their career?
It's like we've been saying, keep your eye on the ball, keep your eye on the long game, but learn to play the game as well. I mean, women, I'm going to make some sweeping assertions now. Women are notoriously bad at making sure that what they do is they tend to get their head down and do a really good job and assume that they will be noticed. That is just not, you can't just do that. You've got to make sure that the people know you've done a good job and that you are creating the right networks and you've got the right sponsors. And I think men are typically much better at doing that than we are. I think we're also notoriously bad at negotiation. I was very admiring the other day. I was talking to a woman who she works in an 80% week. So her salary is prorated. So her base salary is 80% of what it would be were she 100%. And this is just to afford her the flexibility she needs around her children. And she was telling me that when it came to the annual performance appraisal, she was ranked top of her group. But when she looked at the bonus she got, her bonus in financial terms was the lowest. And it was because it had been prorated, they'd given her 80% of the top bonus. And she's gone back, she's made a very, very clear and succinct business case, which she's sent to the head of talent at her organization to say, this is ridiculous. The bonus is about output. The fact that it only took me 80% of I only work 80% of a week that's completely irrelevant. My output meant that I was ranked top, so my bonus should not be prorated, and they're reviewing it, and I'm sure they will agree with her.
Well, fingers crossed, really. Yeah, I do hope so.
How many women would do that, and how many would just moan about it and just put their heads down and get on?
I know this is such an important point. I want to underscore that. And actually, I recently heard an interview and Beth Comstock, who's an ex-GE executive, she was talking about a point in her career where there was a position being open and she thought that she was an ideal candidate for that position in her company, the company that she was working in. And she felt very frustrated because she was not approached for that position. And eventually she decided to get over herself and go to her boss and say, I'd like to get that position. And she did. And he said, well, actually we thought about you, Beth, but we know that you have young kids and this job requires a lot of travel. So we thought that probably it wouldn't be good for you. And she was like, oh my God, I couldn't believe that. And, I was frustrated and angry with them, but also I was really angry with myself because I was hoping that they would think about
Absolutely.
me, but I could never imagine that the way they would think about me is that I have small kids and therefore I cannot travel. And she said, well, let me decide, whether it's a good match for me or not. And eventually she did get the job, but it's just a perfect illustration
we have
that
to
you
speak
really
up
need
more.
to, yes.
And I had a similar experience recently. So obviously we've got this book out and somebody else brought a book out around the same time. And she is with a big publisher and she obviously had a very large PR budget because she was in the press all over the place. I kept seeing her on various social media sites, in the newspapers, etc., etc. And she was featured. There's a clothing brand called The Fold here in the UK. It's based in London. It's aimed at women who work in the city. It's really nice tailored workwear. Anyway, they do a feature every month called The Fold Woman, and they interview someone and they feature her on their website and do promotions around her. And this woman who brought a book out appeared in July as The Fold Woman. And I stomped around the house and moaned that we didn't have any PR budget and it was not fair and blah, blah, blah. And I thought, hang on a minute, why don't I email The Fold, tell them about my book and suggest that I would be a good Fold woman? Yeah. So I did. I retweeted them because they follow me on Twitter. And they came back and said, that sounds fabulous. And so in September, I am The Fold Woman. And,
Whoa,
you just wouldn't have got that. I'll send you the link. And it's a lovely piece. And it tells my story. And my book is ideally, it's perfectly aimed at their customer base. And apparently lots of people ask them. So, sometimes you've just got to be a bit bold.
Yeah, absolutely. There's this guy, his name is James Altucher, and he wrote a book, Choose Yourself. And I think all women should read this book because basically the main premise of this book is that we are waiting for a permission slip from someone.
Totally.
Right? Yeah. And especially as women. And again, it's a sweeping assumption, I know. And of course, not all women are like that, but I think culturally we've been conditioned to wait for that permission slip. Yeah. And the big news is that we can give this permission slip to ourselves.
And I think there's a bigger point there as well, because if I go back to my friend who works an 80% week, I reckon in her week she does as much as lots of people who are on 100%. Yeah. But the minute women think they need a bit of flexibility, they have to go to all sorts of lengths to get permission to agree the details of how they're going to make that work.
This is actually my story as well. I was working for a professional firm, PwC, and at some point in my career, I wanted to write a book, and I felt like I wouldn't be able to pull it off if I was working full time. And so I was very hesitant to ask my boss for an 80% off. And I was almost convinced that they would say no. But surprise, surprise. So the first thing was they did say yes. And so I thought, oh, wow, that's amazing. But then my next assumption was that my career options are going to be limited. And so when the time came that normally I would be going for promotion, I wouldn't even consider it. And then my friend said, why not? Just put yourself forward for it and see what happens. And I was like, no, this definitely is something that's not going to happen, not when I'm 80%. And eventually I did put myself forward, and the answer was, of course. So for me, it was such a perfect illustration of how our self-limiting beliefs are really not helpful at all, and they are what they are. They are self-limiting.
Totally.
Very often when we reach out and are a little bit more assertive, our environment, our companies are willing to say yes.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the first chapters in the practical piece of our book. The first chapter is we talk about it begins in your head. And we talk about the fact that when women decide they want to go back, first of all, the stories they tell themselves limit the jobs they go for. They think, oh, well, I could only do something part-time. I'm not as skilled as I used to be. I've lost all my confidence. My technology's passed me by. And we really encourage people in that chapter to step back and figure out what's true and what is just a belief that needs to be challenged and can be changed.
Absolutely. I don't know if you've heard about this research, but apparently men will apply for a
Oh, yeah.
job if they meet 90%, sorry, 60%,
Yeah.
60% of requirements, whereas women hesitate even if they meet 90%,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. I've seen that in action. A very, very skilled friend of mine who'd never had a break was moving from one job to another. And I actually introduced her to this new job. And she looked at the job spec and she pointed to the one thing she hadn't got experience of and said, oh, no, I have not done that. I was like, no.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah.
Okay, so for our listeners, I suppose that, as I said at the beginning, I'm sure that a lot of people resonate with those issues, even if it's not them personally. They have a sister or a friend or someone they know that wants to come back. So what is your advice to people who are just getting ready to come back? What can they do today to be more ready and be successful in getting reintegrated?
Well, I'd talk about three things. Assuming you've sorted your head out and you've got in your head.
Correct.
The first thing you need to do, and the reason I'm going to say these things, the first two of these, is that you're 5 times more likely to find work through your network than you are through a recruiter.
5 times.
5 times more likely, according to our research. So that means two things. It means, first of all, you have got to build your network, and your network is much more powerful than you think. There will be people that you know at the school gates who can introduce you to people that ultimately might get you an interview. You can. It's easier than ever to rebuild connections with people you might have worked with in the past because you can use LinkedIn. You know, the technology is that you don't have to go to horrible networking events to build your network. But so you have to reconnect with the sorts of people who might be able to give you an introduction or get somebody who'll sit with you for a coffee and talk about, you know, what value they think you could add somewhere. So that's number 2, because number 1 is you have to have your story straight. Your network can only help you if you can tell them who you are, where you add value, why somebody might want to employ you, and what you're interested in. So there's a whole chapter talking about, we call it Get Your Story Straight, which is about you and your brand. So it's not, you know, people come to me and it drives me insane. I'll get an email from someone saying, hi, I'm a mum, I've got 2 kids, I'm looking for part-time work. I'm like, well, join the club. You know, 80% of working women are mums.
Starting with the limitations.
Doesn't differentiate you, and it's starting with your limitations.
Yeah.
You know, what do you want to do? Are you an astronaut, a street cleaner, what? You know, it's no good. So you have to begin with the 2 things are get your story straight and build your network. And then the third thing I would encourage people to do is think about what skills they're going to need to make this all work. And there's a lot of people campaigning and banging on about flexibility. But for me, the flip side of that is knowing that you are a highly efficient, very productive, very creative person in the time you've got. And that's about knowing when your creative energies are high, thinking about how you're going to be, I'd call it a productivity ninja, like be really super efficient and be confident that when you're going to say, I can do that job and I can do it in this particular working pattern, you've really thought that through and you've got those skills in place.
Right. Fantastic. Lisa, it's such a pleasure to be speaking to you. Such an important topic that we've discussed today. So I think that we're ready to move on to our rapid fire questions.
Okay.
And it's a series of 5 questions that I ask in rapid succession. They're all about organizational culture. And the first one is, how do you define organizational culture?
I would say it's the behaviors and norms.
And what are the signs that a company culture needs some work or perhaps even a major overhaul?
I think one sign is if you look at the rhetoric on an organization's website and it says one thing, and you look at the behaviors and see something totally different. So, for example, if the website says we value diversity and you go and sit in reception and everyone looks the same, there's clearly something wrong.
Love that. So are there any books on leadership or on culture that you would recommend our listeners read?
I really love, I'm not sure it's necessarily on culture, but I love a book by Annabel Crabb, who's an Australian journalist, called The Wife Drought. And the subheading is why women need wives and men need lives. And I think that says it all. It's a funny book. And it is about culture, because she talks about the culture of society and how it's set up to have women doing one role and men doing another. And actually the solution is not just simply to get more women back at work, it's to have more men doing more caring. So I think that's something.
I love that, and I haven't heard of it.
It's really good.
Thank you
funny
for that
as well.
Fantastic. What is one thing that our listeners can do tomorrow to build their own culture lab and start cultivating a culture that will help them and their teams to bring their vision to life?
Do you know, one of the things that I've really found most helpful in the last 12 months is I listen to podcasts, and I've come across some fabulous podcasts on work culture and working life that are really interesting to read. And two that I would recommend are one by Bruce Daisley, who is the VP of Twitter. And it's called Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat. And he has some fabulous guests talking about work culture. And the second one is by a British woman who is based in New York, called The Broad Experience. And she talks a lot about work culture, but specifically issues affecting women. So I found those two really fabulously.
Fantastic. So I think, as a general comment, it's if you want to start experimenting, it's good also to build your awareness about the issues and learn from others. So listen to podcasts. I love podcasts too, obviously. I love that recommendation. Here is the moment where you can leave our listeners with some final thoughts. What would you like people to be taking away with them from our conversation today?
I would like people to take away energy and enthusiasm, thinking that actually, whatever, if they have stepped back from a career at all, or then there is an opportunity to go back and get more out of the next 20, 30 years or whatever it is. Equally, if you are feeling totally overwhelmed and fed up that you haven't got the right work-life balance and you feel like you need to take a break, it's okay. You can do that. You can, because you can step up again, but you just need a plan.
Yeah, I love that. Lisa, thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for being our guest. I really, really enjoyed it.
Pleasure.
Thank you, Lisa Unwin, for this conversation. And thank you, our listeners, for tuning in. Thank you to our sound producer, James Eade of Be Heard, our production manager, Lindsay Nunes, content editor, Rachel Nice, and art director, Emily Spencer. If you like Culture Lab, I would be ever so grateful if you could rate and review this podcast on iTunes. It helps us to get the word out there and enables listeners like you to find the podcast. By rating, reviewing, and sharing with your network, you help us create the ripples that contribute to building awesome workplace cultures. And before we go, I have a preview of the next episode for you. This time, my guest is Barnaby Lashbrook. He's the founder and CEO of a company that I truly love. They're called Time Etc., and it's a virtual assistant service that brings busy entrepreneurs and incredible assistants together. Barnaby and his team are on a mission to help people achieve more. And I have to say, they've certainly been successful in supporting me to get more done over the past year or so. Barnaby is a really, really incredible guy. He started his entrepreneurial journey at 17 from his bedroom where he ran a web hosting company. I really would like you to make sure that you don't miss this episode, because Barnaby is a huge inspiration, and what he's been able to achieve with Time Etc. is a testament to the importance of leadership and a healthy company culture. Here is a short preview of our conversation.
I sort of transitioned to maybe a more authentic leader who was really doing things not to be strategic, not to be clever, I didn't set up values because I thought, oh yes, we must have values so people know how to behave. I did it because I really wanted everyone to know, how they can feel when they're in this business. And that transition from strategic and looking at spreadsheets and trying to grow the company as quickly as possible to really discovering myself and becoming more authentic and probably being more comfortable with myself and the others around me, and changing who I was bringing into the team as a result of that, really helped to make things like the values come alive and start forming the culture that we've got.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Cultureland. If you found any moments that were interesting, inspiring, or maybe even game-changing, please share it with someone who'd appreciate it. After all, good ideas are meant to be shared.